I think that you, whoever you are, even if you are a monolingual English speaker, can learn to read Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish pretty easily. What I want to do in this video is give you some tips and tricks to make what might look at first like something totally unfamiliar on the page look like what it is in reality, a close but often forgotten sister to the English language. I'm going to break this up into 5 sections. First section, credentials, why I'm the one telling you this. Second section, what languages are we talking about? And then I'm going to talk about pronunciation, word recognition, and resources. I'm going to focus on free resources for these languages. For that pronunciation, word recognition, resource section, so that nobody thinks I'm playing favorites, I am going to roll a die to decide whether to cover Danish, Norwegian, or Swedish under each one, and I'll cover a different one as my focus for each one. They're all very closely related. I'm just going to really pray Danish doesn't come up for pronunciation. It's really hard to imitate and teach. So to start with on credentials, I, by reflex, kind of automatically identify myself at the beginning of my YouTube videos as Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. That's exactly what I am. I have a PhD in Scandinavian Studies from the University of Wisconsin. I have been faculty at Scandinavian language departments or programs at the University of California, Los Angeles, the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Colorado, Boulder. Languages that I have taught at those universities, I taught Old Norse and Norwegian at UCLA. I taught Icelandic at Berkeley. And I taught other classes too, and all of them, mythology and Vikings and things like that. Old Norse is my focus, so it's the one that I'm perhaps most exposed to, but anyone who has a background in studying Old Norse has to know modern Scandinavian as well. It was a requirement at my PhD program. Everyone getting a PhD in Scandinavian studies has to demonstrate competence in Norwegian, Swedish, or Danish as their primary language. Whatever your primary is, you are well equipped to read the other two of those three. So every year I keep track of my reading, and just for the record, I do about as much reading in Scandinavian as in English. For example, in 2025, I read uh, at least 50% in Scandinavian and 35% in English. And I'm sure more than 50 was in Scandinavian, actually, because it's not every one of the languages at the first stat on my little document that I can see. Anyway, very familiar with these languages. And I'm most familiar with them as a reader. So let's talk about what these languages are and what I will and will not be talking about in terms of languages in this video. So typically, how you define Scandinavia varies. Sometimes people draw this distinction between Scandinavia versus Norden. Typically, when they make the distinction, they're including Sweden, Denmark, and Norway as Scandinavia, and then Norden as including Greenland, the Faroes, and Iceland and Finland. I don't care that much about this distinction. And what I'm going to be talking about is Scandinavian in the strict sense anyway. But within Norden, we have 5 sovereign countries and actually a surprising multitude of languages. From most to least populated sovereign state, we have Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Iceland. Now, in Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland, the languages are all related. They all come from Old Norse. So to me, if you think of me as the Old Norse guy as being the Latin guy, all of these are kind of like if I'm a Latin guy looking at French or Italian or Spanish, right? They all kind of read as later forms of the language that I academically specialize in. Sometimes people sort of overemphasize the difference between East Norse and West Norse, but it's certainly true that Eastern dialects of Old Norse are what give us Swedish and Danish today. Through Danish, they also feed into Norwegian bokmål. Western dialects are what give us Faroese and Icelandic and Norwegian nynorsk. I don't want to dwell in this video on the difference between the two written forms of Norwegian, Norwegian bokmål and Norwegian nynorsk. For the record, I write Norwegian nynorsk, but I'm going to be talking about Norwegian bokmål because it is the majority form. You're going to find more resources in Norwegian bokmål. I have made videos about bokmål versus nynorsk, etc., and I may make a follow-up to this about nynorsk if enough people are interested. I'm also in this video not going to focus on Icelandic and Faroese. Again, that could well be a good follow-up video, but Icelandic and Faroese retain a lot of the grammatical complexity of Old Norse, which Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish do not. So Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian have gone through a lot of change. Their grammar has become, linguists, please note my heavy scare quotes because this is a popular understanding of the word, not a linguist's understanding of the term. The grammar has been simplified, air quotes off now, and in a similar direction as English. They're actually easier to understand than the more archaically structured Icelandic and Faroese. Now, Old Norse itself is descended from an earlier stage, Proto-Germanic, and English, German, and Dutch are from the West Germanic languages of the Middle Ages. Old English, Old High German, Old Low Franconian, Old Saxon, etc. Proto-Germanic also ultimately goes back to Proto-Indo-European, so that all of these languages are from the same earlier reconstructed ancestor language about 5,000 years ago that we call Proto-Indo-European, which is also ancestral to the Slavic languages, to Latin, to Greek, to Farsi, etc. Now, Finnish and Sami, which is spoken in the far north of Norway, Sweden, and Finland, are Uralic languages. They are not related to the other languages in Scandinavia. So I will not be covering those here either. Nothing about reading Swedish, Norwegian, or Danish is going to help you read Finnish or Sami, believe me. I have become all right at reading Finnish, getting better all the time. Not professional competence, so I'm not going to cover that here. I could eventually make some kind of follow-up about reading Finnish, but it would be from a much more amateur perspective. And then of course, Greenlandic is from the Inuit family of languages. So Greenlandic is related to languages spoken by other Inuit speaking peoples in northern Canada, northern Alaska. So that's also from a completely different ancestral language. It is strange to reflect, but in fact, Finnish is as distant from Swedish or Danish as Greenlandic is. And I do not know Greenlandic. I have not been able to find enough resources to begin to have a good understanding of that language beyond the most basic facts that I could tell you about it. What I'm going to focus on in this video are the three mutually intelligible mainland Scandinavian languages, the languages of Scandinavia in the strictest sense: Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian. And for Norwegian, I'll be focusing on Norwegian bokmål because it's the majority form. However, I write Norwegian nynorsk, so if you want to get on me about the bokmål versus nynorsk thing, I am playing against type in a sense here. All right, now let's get down to pronunciation, word recognition, and resources. About to roll this die and see which one I'm going to talk about the pronunciation of as your guidance. Before I do that, folks, if you like what I do on this channel, my free videos about language, linguistics, myth, runes, etc., please visit my friends at grimfrost.com. They are wonderful craftsmen of Viking and Norse stuff. A lot of their stuff has particularly good, historically accurate runes, often done by me. And they will ship just about anywhere in the world. They do eat tariffs and import taxes as of January 2026. So check them out. Be a friend of the channel. Tell them that I sent you. All right. 1 to 2 is going to be Danish. 3 to 4 is going to be Norwegian. 5 to 6 is going to be Swedish. All right. It's a 5. So I'm going to focus on pronunciation, focusing on Swedish. Keep in mind that I'm not a native speaker of any of these languages, but neither are you if you're watching this. So let's go to Swedish Wikipedia, sv.wikipedia.org. And why don't we get ourselves a random article? Our random Swedish article is Götalandsviadukten. Let's talk about some of the critical pronunciation points for Scandinavian languages using Swedish as our basis. Now, Swedish and Norwegian are overall pronounced rather alike in most respects. Danish is pronounced quite differently from the other two. Swedish and Norwegian combined have a bit more population than Danish, so it may be perhaps a little bit more reasonable if you are agnostic about which one to go with Swedish pronunciation anyway. All right, let's talk about some of the main points. One of them is, of course, letters that we don't have in English. Among them, that O with two dots, that A with two dots, and the A with a halo. Now, all three languages use the A with a halo, but what Swedish spells as O with two dots is spelled as O with a slash in Norwegian and Danish. What Swedish spells as A with two dots is spelled as the AE ligature in Norwegian and Danish that in English is often called ash. For most American and Canadian speakers of English, the vowel of A with a halo is a little bit difficult to imitate in some ways. It's rather like our O, if you think about a word like known or boat. But in known or boat, we pronounce a diphthong. We're a little bit closer if we think about the O that we pronounced before an R in a word like or. Just cut that R off and you get a shorter vowel than an own or boat, O. Or think about, and I'm deliberately going with movie stereotypes about these places. If you think about a New Jersey pronunciation, Northern New Jersey pronunciation of like coffee, it's kind of that vowel. Or think about a Minnesota guy's pronunciation of a boat. It's that. So bog brew is what we're seeing right here. Bog brew. And I'll come back to why I'm pronouncing that O as a U in a moment. Now that O with two dots or that O with a slash, the closest I can give you as guidance in English, because we don't have this sound, is think about the word bird or word, and think about Arnold Schwarzenegger saying it, again with movie perceptions, right? But bird. It's kind of that vowel. So this is Götaland. Götaland. And I'm going to come back to why I'm pronouncing that G as a Y in a moment too. And then this vowel is easy. The A with two dots or the AE ligature, that's the vowel in hat. All right. So in Swedish, that actually kind of leans a little harder toward the vowel in like pets, right? It's a little bit higher than that ah. But if you target an ah, you'll be understandable enough if you're reading a word out to somebody, whether you're talking Norwegian, Swedish, or Danish. Now, two other things that I mentioned there. I said, why am I pronouncing this O as a U in this word bogbru? So O is pronounced like a U most of the time. If it's not followed by two consonants, or if it's not just a small function word, like this word, generally just pronounced O, is and. But in a word where it's not followed by a consonant, or it's followed by only one consonant, in general is pronounced as U, brun, stewed. All right? So how is an actual U pronounced? Like in this word, or in this word. That's pronounced a little bit further forward in your mouth. Think about making the eh sound like in pet, eh, but instead of saying eh, say oo. Just keep your tongue and lips positioned the same way. E. It's a little bit further forward in your mouth. And then there's yet another U-like sound, which is spelled Y, and that's going to be very far forward in your mouth, right about where you would have a surfer dude saying the vowel in dude. So look at this, for example. Verktyg, tyg, tyg. So if you look at your mouth, here's your front top teeth. Here's your uvula. Here's your tongue. Here's your bottom front teeth. I guess you're a dinosaur. You have Y way at the front. You have U kind of in the middle. And you have O in the back. Starting at the front, E, U, U. I'm not a native speaker, but that's getting pretty close to the way that's going to sound from a Scandinavian speaker. Acceptable enough for English speakers. Now let's talk about why I pronounce the G at the beginning of this word as a Y. Most of the time, a G is going to be pronounced like the G in English, go, right? Go or gore or give or whatever, right? It's typically going to be that kind of a sound, right? So this, for example, right here that I'm underlining, dagens. But if that G comes before a vowel that is not a back vowel, and our back vowels are U, O, and ah. If instead it comes before a front vowel, an I, a Y, an E, an O with two dots, an A with two dots. Before this, we're going to pronounce G as if it's a Y. And we're going to pronounce K in linguists. I know this isn't exactly right, but especially in a Swedish context, it's going to sound a lot like a sh before those vowels. And if we see an SK or an SJ, we're going to pronounce that a lot like what sounds like the hua in an older American's what or where or when. So these vowels following these consonants change how these consonants are otherwise pronounced. So ska would normally sound like ska, ka normally sounds like ka, ga normally sounds like ga, but they change before these vowels. So this is Götaland, not Götaland, Götaland. And likewise, if we look for a nice K before a, here we go, Shallor, 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 sources, okay? Or if we look for an SK or an SJ, we ought to have something on this page somewhere. There we go, in that place name right there, Älvsjö, Älvsjö, right? This is sea, ocean, sjö, not, I don't know what you would think in English, Sujou or something, sjö, right? I think with those main comments about things that are unexpected, most other things about the pronunciation of Scandinavian will be reasonably expected. Just remember that the emphasis is more consistently on the first syllable than it's going to be in English, unless the first syllable is a prefix, and often prefixes look a fair amount like the prefixes in English. So, ba, same kind of prefixes in like belong, on is a prefix, around is a prefix. But if you generally emphasize the first syllable, you're going to do okay. Nobody's going to mistake me for a native Swedish speaker ever, and that's not the point. The point is to be able to ask somebody, oh, what does this word mean? And pronounce it in a way they'll realize what you're saying. So just to read this paragraph in my, again, American accent. Götalandsviadukten är en vägbro för Götalandsvägen över banområdet och Åbyvägen norr om Älvsjö station i stadsdelen Liseberg, södra Stockholm. Den första bron var en tidig bågbro i betong som anlades här omkring 1910. Nuvarande bron stod färdig 1967. Two things that occurred to me as I read that TI in words like station also gets that kind of sound. And G's after R are also pronounced as a Y in Swedish. So Liseberg. So if you watch a movie by a famous director or a movie that features a famous uh, Swedish actor, actress. I'm not the best at movie stuff. The director of the Seventh Seal has a name that ends in Berg or Borg, right? So, for example, there's the city Göteborg, right? Not Göteborg, as you might want to pronounce it, Göteborg. All right. Some basics about pronunciation using Swedish as a starting point. Now, let's look at word recognition. 1 to 3, I'm going to use Danish as the basis. 4 to 6, I'm going to use Norwegian as the basis. All right. 4 to 6, I rolled a 5, use Norwegian as the basis. Let's see what we can get as far as a random article on Norwegian Wikipedia. There it's higher on this menu. All right. Here is a random article about a street in Oslo. Words that are not going to be immediately recognizable from English, but that you need to know. We got a whole bunch of them right here. If you make yourself flashcards for some of these most basic words, you'll be doing yourself a big favor. So this is a street. Oh, that's one of the most basic words. On, in, with, to, from. All right. So some basic verbs and some basic prepositions may not look immediately like their English cognates or equivalents, but are very good to know early on. Er means is. En or et with a T. En or et is a, an, depending on the gender of the word. På is on, I is in, me is with. Norwegians, and usually Swedes too, don't pronounce the D at the end there. Fra is from, till is to. Those are going to be some words that may not immediately jump out at you as related, but otherwise are, just important to know to start reading. And they're all, 1 to 3 letters, so not so hard. Now, I think that it is quite possible to read an article about any random subject whatsoever in a Scandinavian language and largely figure out what you are looking at without having to look up words. And you'll get better at this, of course, as you kind of let go, be Luke Skywalker on the Millennium Falcon fighting the little sphere thing, and I'm Obi-Wan telling you, let go of your conscious self. Like, accept that very often what looks like an English word is an English word or is equivalent to that English word. Okay, it's not going to be perfect. For example, gata means street. Now, we don't use that in English to mean street, except in place names that come from places that were settled in the Viking Age or early Middle Ages by Scandinavian speakers. There's plenty of places in Yorkshire that have gate at the end, and that just means street. Okay, so Kampengata er en gata på Kampen. So it's a street on Kampen, which is like an area, neighborhood in the bydel. This is a compound. By means city, dale means part. By, you might recognize again, Eastern England, an area settled by a whole lot of Scandinavians once upon a time, has lots of places that end in B, right? Derby, Grimsby, there's a million others of these. I can never think of examples when I need them. But city and then dale, that may look to you a little bit like English deal. It is from the same root. What you're dealt out is your share, your part. So it's the city part. Gamla. That's a word you're not going to recognize necessarily from English. It's old. But if you think about J.R. Tolkien's guy in the Two Towers, who's the first one to shoot an arrow at the orcs, his name is Gamling, the old one. So this word did exist in older English. With the name, now here is a major, major tip for you. When you see et at the end of a word, here's a good example with name, or you see en at the end of a word. Most of the time, what you're looking at is the word the. So the word the is suffixed to the noun in Scandinavian languages. It's in for most nouns, common gender nouns, words that are masculine or feminine in Old Norse, and it's t for neuter gender words. Can't necessarily look at a word and know right away whether it's going to be one gender or the other, but dictionaries will tell you. And of course, it doesn't really matter for reading. All you have to know is, oh, that's the article, it's the word the. So this is the name, navne. This is the city expansion. This is the street. Okay, so gata, en gata, the street, a street, gaten, the street. We're taking in a sense that a word and sort of putting it at the end. That's not historically what it is, but you could think about it that way. Same thing here, adressen, right? It's adressa would be like en adressa, an address, but adressen, the address. Where else? Not everything that ends in en is, or et is going to be that, but it's going to be very often the article, the word the. Here we go. The sister, systeren, a sister, en syster. The door, døren, a door, en dør. The head, hudet, a head, et hude. All right. Krigen, the war, a war, en krig. Okay. So watch for en and et, which generally as suffixes mark the, and as separate words mark an. Otherwise, generally, a word that starts with v is going to be related to an English word that starts with w. So var is related to English was. Sometimes there's some really easy ones, none of which I really see here. Venstre means left. We don't really have an equivalent word in English. Vis means show, but here's one up here, verktøy. Verktøy, tools. So that's the English word work, okay? So work in English, verk in Norwegian, similar in Swedish and Danish. Another important thing to recognize is when you're looking at verbs. Scandinavian languages are V2, as linguists say, verb second. So the verb is going to be the second syntactic constituent in the sentence or clause. You could sort of generalize to saying it's going to be the second word in the sentence. It's not always going to be exactly true, because if we're talking about like, a bear is, then, a bear, that's two words in Norwegian too, and bjarn, air. But it's going to be the second constituent, right? After you've stated the subject, or after you've stated whatever adverb might start the clause, the second word is going to be the subject. So there's going to be the verb. So er is, gård, goes. Okay. Lo, lay. Ligger, lies, is situated. Ble, became. Another good little word to learn. Var, was. Generally following whatever adverbs, and here's a huge, like we're talking about the place that something's happening. So this is a big situational adverbial sort of syntactic constituent. But generally, second syntactic constituent is going to be your verb. In the present tense, verbs end in R. Okay, so gård, ligger. Where's another present tense? These may all be past tense. But gård, ligger are ligger, gård are present tense verbs. If you want to look up a verb, knock that R off. What you're going to look up for that is go, G, and A halo. For this, you're going to knock that R off and you're going to look up ligge. Past tense is going to be a little bit less predictable. You wouldn't necessarily guess that the past tense of ligge, to lie, to be situated, is law, but it's the same in English, right? Lie, lay. Right? The relationship is as unpredictable contemporaneously. So reach out with your feelings. Be ready to accept that a word that looks like an English word may in fact be. And don't be afraid to knock R's off of verbs and assume that the meaning is probably pretty close to the meaning of the English word that looks like it without the R, right? Knock the R off of gård. Go looks a lot like English go, sounds a lot like go. If you remember that G's in Scandinavian languages often correspond to Y's or W's in English, and you kind of substitute that or just cut off the G. Ligge doesn't look too different, sound too different from lie. Where else might there be an example of this? There may not be any other great examples of this here, but slag is related to English slay, for example, even though it doesn't mean the same thing. It's a strike, right? Not a killing. But another thing is English words that start with th, generally they're Scandinavian cognates, not in Icelandic, but in Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, are going to start with D's and T's. So, da is then, not necessarily a super obvious one. D is the, that's not being suffixed to the noun because we're using it with a number. D, two, they, two, those two. Here we have død, which is death. The first D is cognate with English D, the second D with an English TH. So generally, English Ds are going to be Scandinavian Ds, like hede, the head, but English TH is going to be a Norwegian, Swedish, Danish D or T as well. I hope some of those clues help you figure out how to read Scandinavian languages a little bit easier. Now, let's talk about resources. And for this, I'm going to use a Danish Wikipedia article. The random article that I pulled up in Danish is actually a city in Portugal. Okay. But I recommend that if you are trying to learn to read another language better, one of the best things you can do is focus on getting your information and your entertainment in that language. So, for example, let's say that I'm really trying to learn Danish. Use Danish Wikipedia when you're curious about something, right? You just found out that a friend is from Portimao. Okay, I'm not going to look that up in English Wikipedia. I'm not going to go to en.wikipedia.org. I'm going to go to dk.wikipedia.org and look this up and get my information that way. This is a huge advantage that, in a sense, Scandinavians have over us, is that our languages are closely related. It's easy for a speaker of one to learn the other, but English speakers don't feel compelled, or, it sounds like this is a forced thing, but they don't feel like they need to go to Scandinavian language sources for their entertainment or information. But because these language communities in Scandinavia are fairly small, they are learning English from a young age, not just from school. In fact, I would say school is the least of it. They're learning just from watching TV and using the internet because that's what, the shows are in. That's what the movies are in. That's what the cool websites are in, and the social media platforms are often in, etc. As an English speaker, one of the reasons why we struggle with learning other languages is just that lack of necessity, right? We're not sort of funneled into it just from needing to use something. But if you duplicate that for yourself a little bit, right? I'm going to turn on Danish subtitles on this Star Trek episode I'm watching, or I'm going to use Danish Wikipedia. That's a good way to help yourself learn. Okay, So let's say I'm reading my little article here in Danish Wikipedia. So Portimao er en by, and I'm not going to sound very Danish here. I'm going to stick with the more Swedish-like pronunciation that we focused on earlier. It's easier to learn. Er en by i Portugal. All right, it's a city in Portugal. Easy enough. There, uh, that is related to the English word there, and it means there. All this spelled D-A, two dots, R in Swedish means there in all these languages, but in Danish also used to mean which. Um, Norwegian and Swedish don't use it that way. Ligger, we saw that in the Norwegian article, lies, is situated. But let's say that I don't recognize this. I can see that it's a verb. Right, what does this mean? One of the best resources you can use is actually Wiktionary. So this is basically the Wikipedia dictionary. It's a wiki project. I recommend don't bookmark the homepage, right? Wiktionary.org. Bookmark a random word that you look up because for some reason the search feature works really well if you start from a page that has an entry on it. But if you just go to the home page, it seems like for whatever reason you can only look up English words if you're using English Wiktionary. You want to be able to search all languages. So bookmark, like I have for whatever reason, 25 years ago, I'm sure it's not that long, I bookmarked Proto-Germanic Bauhaus, and that's just my starting point. But okay, I'm gonna look this up. I might remember that R is probably the present tense ending, so I might remember to look up ligge, and sure enough, here I'm going to see the Danish lie, be situated, be placed, occupy, place, stand, etc. Okay, great. Now, by the way, same thing applies if I see an R elsewhere that's not a verb, right? So here we see Portimao er blant de største byer. So it is among the biggest cities. This is also the plural for most words. You add an R. So knock that ER off and look up B. Of course, you got to find Danish. If you click on languages here, you can go to it a little bit faster. You can see town and plural byer. Okay. You're also going to see if you click on declension, the definite form, the city, byen, the cities, byerne. You can also add an S, just like in English, to mean cities, right? So like the city's wall, this byens, not sure, I guess in Danish, probably neuter, if I had to guess. So that will help you a lot too. And probably you can look up these words without knocking that R off. You're just going to have to click through because they say, okay, present tense of, ligge. Okay, I'm going to look at be here. Okay, plural of be. All right, it's going to help you out a little bit, but you can save yourself a half second by knowing to knock off that R or ER to get the singular form of a noun or the base dictionary infinitive form of a verb. I hope that these general skills will help. Wiktionary is great. Google Translate is okay-ish. I don't like it very much, but sometimes it's, the easiest resource to hand, especially on a phone. You just have the app. If you're using Google Translate, translate word by word, right? Don't throw entire sentences into it. It can mess things up. But as sort of a dictionary word by word, it can be pretty okay. Just be aware too that Google Translate isn't always smart about context and words that have multiple meanings. It may not always give you the meaning. Trust yourself to go through these dictionary entries before you trust Google Translate. I also have, dictionaries bookmarked for languages that I use a lot. I mean, because I write Norwegian more than Danish or Swedish. I have ordbøkene.no bookmarked for Norwegian. I have Svenska Akademiens ordbok bookmarked for Swedish. I don't have a Danish dictionary bookmark because I don't write in Danish very much, but Wiktionary is certainly good. Now, if you want to read the news, each Scandinavian country has different leading papers and websites and whatever. And for Danish, dr.dk is often my first stop if I'm looking for the news in Danish. Another berlingske.dk, major uh, major sites that I go to. This is, I believe, it would be fair to say, the Danish newspaper of record. And hopefully you can already see lots of words that you recognize there. A, historisk kapitel for Europa er slut. This is a historic chapter for Europe is done. Make fun of this if you want, but that's the Scandinavian word for done or over. You're going to see that all the time in the ends of movies. So, of course, if you're a speaker of one of these languages, native speaker, take this for what it is. It's a non-native speaker trying to help other non-native speakers get a better grip on reading these languages and appreciating that they are quite closely related to English. If you're not a native speaker and you've used resources that have helped you read, I'm really talking about reading, not conversational stuff here, feel free to share those. And to everyone out there from beautiful Colorado, please know that I'm wishing you all the best.